about exhibition, furniture, on paper and off, and I am delighted to introduce my co-curator and colleague, Amy, the moderator of the panel today.
Thank you all so much for coming. It really is wonderful to have you here on such a beautiful sunny day, and I just feel so honored to have this, all of this happening. We had such a wonderful time putting this exhibition together. Working with Ricardo was great, and his staff was amazing. I've never had a staff in putting a show together before, and it's just amazing. These guys just, I need people because such an amazing job. Pat Kenyanis, Jeff Ludwig, Mark Wansidler, Bob Varisco, and Denise Stengel, especially those people. They have done so much to try to get this thing going, and of course Ricardo, who kind of spearheaded the whole thing. We've got other people I need to thank, and I'll try to make this quick, but we've had some additional funding that was really very necessary. Tony Viscardi in the architecture department kicked in some money to help me bring all these wonderful people. Norm Girodeau and Sheila White and Arts Lehigh kind of got together and found some money for us from the Humanities Center and from their own funds, and also from Science, Technology, and Society. We really, really, really appreciate it. Pam Manji, who was our miraculous department coordinator, we go to her whenever there's any question about anything, and she knows the answer. And Tom Hucker, who was supposed to be here. We were hoping he would come and give a talk, but one of his clients suddenly needed a piece of furniture really soon, and this would have been Tom. But Tom had put together the exhibition upstairs, where if you go into this area where there's a PowerPoint presentation, it's an amazing thing because this has never been done before, as far as I know, and Ned can tell me if that's true, but he wrote all of these, or called all of these furniture makers, pulled together drawings and final pieces, and you can look at the drawing and the final piece in relation to each other and see how the artist was thinking about it. And it's an amazing kind of cross-section of what is happening in contemporary studio furniture, and even a little bit into the past. So I really appreciate Tom letting us borrow that for this exhibition. It's going to start getting published everywhere because everybody's excited about it, but we got the scoop, so we're starting it off. And I also really want to thank Ned Cook and Jerry Osgood and Isabel Moore for coming all the way here. They all come from New England. They've all driven down here to be part of this today, and you're in for such a treat. I've known these people for quite some time, and you couldn't find a better group of people, so I think you'll really enjoy talking to them as well. Before I get on and start introducing them, I have a few reminders. One is that tomorrow at 10 a.m., any of you that are interested in knowing how Jerry makes his amazing bent wood pieces, he's going to be giving a workshop at Wilbur Building tomorrow, starting at 10 in the morning. And that'll go probably 10 to lunchtime, we're thinking. He's going to show his famous technical slides, in which he shows you how gravity can be defied in many different ways while clamping things. Anyway, we hope to see as many of you there as possible. We also have 2 more lectures in this series. 2 more of the makers of these pieces are going to be coming and giving us lectures. One is Brent Skidmore, and he'll be Thursday, September 22nd at 4:30. And Cheryl Riley will be coming as well, and she'll be Thursday, October 13th at 4:30. Same place in both cases. So now I would like to introduce our panel. We have Jerry Osgood, first of all, at our far left. He is a fellow of the American Craft Council. He won the Furniture Society's Award of Distinction back in 2003, which is a very big deal. It's an award of his peers. He's going to start downplaying all of this. He has pieces represented in major museum collections throughout the United States, And he's also been the teacher of many, many very influential furniture makers now. So not only does he make wonderful work of his own, but he makes wonderful work through these students that he's set loose on the world. So we're really very happy to have him. He's also been an amazing mentor to me. So I really appreciate that as well. Next to Jerry, we have Isabel Moore. And Isabel is now, she's an upcoming furniture maker. Her stuff is amazing. You'll see her picture, the slides of her work. She trained in England at Parnham, which is, it was a fairly traditional school, amazing design run by a fellow named John Makepeace. It's no longer in existence today, but it was an incredible school for some time, and that's where she really learned a lot of her technique. She has taught furniture and drawing at Rhode Island School of Design, and she works in many different media, which I think is pretty interesting. It'll be very interesting, I think, for you to contrast Jerry's work with Isabel's. Both of the work is really beautiful and strong, but very different in that you'll see what I mean. But Isabel also won an International Design Resource Award for design using recycled materials, and she has a piece in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. To my immediate left here is Ned Cook. Ned is the Charles F. Montgomery Professor of American Decorative Arts and Chair of the Department of the History of Art at Yale University. He also was a founding member of the Furniture Society, which has now been in existence for 10 years and has done amazing things for the studio furniture world. He's the author and curator of many, if not all, of the seminal exhibitions and catalogs of the recent studio furniture movement. He also does things on history. He keeps jumping back. I never know which decade he's looking at, which year. Nor does he. Sometimes he's looking at history, and sometimes he's looking at contemporary work. But he always brings an amazing intellect and understanding of kind of all of this stuff. He just pulls it all together. And he is the coiner of the term studio furniture, which I'm going to ask him to define in a few moments. Let me just give you kind of a rough idea of how I imagine this panel going. Normally Ned is the moderator of any panel I'm ever on, and so we're turning the tables a little bit here. But what I'm going to ask is, I'm going to ask Ned to give a brief history of the studio furniture movement. And I knew I could just ask him this on the spot because it's his field. And then I'm going to ask Jerry and Isabel to show a few of their slides so you can sort of see where they're coming from. And we'll talk about the exhibition, we'll talk about studio furniture in general. And please, we want you all to participate. This isn't really a lecture. I hope it's more of a conversation. So feel free to speak up, especially the students in the audience and especially my students. We want you to speak up and ask some questions.
Great to get them.
So welcome. Let me ask Ned to kind of give us some background here on the studio furniture movement.
Thanks, Amy. I'm glad actually you didn't ask me to show slides of my work. Then you could have been in for a disaster here.
No.
Which is experimental. But there were a couple things that seemed to be worthwhile mentioning, and I think Amy sort of gave you some sort of prelude to that. Can you hear me in the back? Do you need a microphone? I mean, my family says I don't need a microphone. I think I will talk loud enough. If it doesn't work out, let me know. But, you know, I come at this whole field as a historian. I mean, my real sort of foundation work was primarily looking into the classical 17th and 18th century furniture that I kept on sort of expanding boundaries and find that it's actually the whole continuum that I'm most interested in. And as a historian, I tend to also think in a certain way that is not necessarily one thing begot the next, which begot the next, sort of in a very genealogical way. My mind tends to work in a different way. I tend to think about layering, how things just keep getting piled up one on top of the other. And if you will borrow sort of a geographic term, what we're constantly doing is looking at different types of stratigraphy. And you can take a slice through it so to see different layers that are bubbled up at any particular time. And if you start looking at sort of material culture and visual culture along those lines, to me it becomes much more interesting rather than sort of favoring instead of almost a fashion sense, a nom de decade, sort of going through and identifying some high points, rather trying to look at continuums, breakpoints, and the like. And when I first got interested in this whole field of what was going on in contemporary furniture, one of the things that really kind of struck me was the ways in which terminology of identification, personal identity were so important that people kept using lots of different terms. And to my mind, what was curious in terms of what was the baggage associated with different terms? Why was it when I went back and do oral interviews as well as going through periodicals and period writings, why was it that in the 1950s people were talking about designer or craftsman or woodworkers? Why was it in the 1960s people were talking about artist craftsmen? Sort of curiosity begets curiosity, and then trying to look into the longer term view, because I started seeing that people were sort of arguing about what is this furniture, and terms like art furniture that came up in the 1960s and 1970s. And of course, to me, what's important is to try thinking about precision of language and trying to really sort of say, well, what do you mean by art furniture in the 1960s or 1970s? Because I knew that that term actually dates back to the 1850s, that people were using terms like art furniture, and it was used to describe a very specific section of furniture production, and that was what I call sort of a time in which architects and artists were getting involved in this idea of reform in making better design with underneath sort of a nationalistic agenda, say in England or in France, where they revised technical training to get people who were going to become furniture designers to draw from life, to work on mechanical drawing. I'm relating it back to the exhibition here. But to also, in some ways, try to figure out ways of defining a certain type of production that was separate from what people thought of as being batch production, what was going on in sort of larger shops. So to me, what I'm always curious about is, in some ways, what you might describe as the trajectory of modern craft, to use a different term here. And that is what happened in the mid-19th century as some of the apprenticeship system, the former way of transferring empirical knowledge and making things, in which one is really cumulatively exploring, taught a certain way to do it, and then how you might continue replicating that, adjusting slightly, but it's always sort of in the guise of making money, being efficient in your time, and in some respects, you were not paid oftentimes for research and development. Still aren't. Actually, there's a point at which, how you were able to do it. But it seems to me what happens in the mid-19th century was a sense of people saying, there's a problem here. That what we're doing is we're getting into this sort of predictable level of production. There's no moralistic charge. I mean, John Ruskin talking about the joy of labor coming back in. And one can fault him in terms of some of his class hierarchies, but the fact is, how do you restore nobility and pleasure to work? And using objects, not only the process of making them, but also what those objects could then sort of impart to the user. So it's both from the shop floor as well as from the consumer. Well, it's curious how it was mainly an intellectual movement that you find people who are writers, people who are artists and architects who oftentimes are coming from the educated class, who are talking about what's going on the shop floor, although they may not have that much expertise themselves. They're curious, they're interested, but they're writing about it, and they sort of had this prognosis that, if we sort of raise our standards, and you find people like E.W. Godwin, who's an architect, who's part of this whole network of London architects and artists who are trying to start to really concentrate on designing domestic objects. They start producing what he calls art furniture, and writes books in which he's illustrating art furniture. And actually, one of the slides that's upstairs in Tom's presentation is an E.W. Godwin drawing and then one of the objects. William Morris sort of takes it a little bit further because he ends up, again, sort of talking about the nobility of work, looking to the past as a way of reinvigorating the present. But in some respects, what the real legacy of people like Ruskin and Morris, yes, they get some of their cohort interested in providing designs for small shops to produce custom, almost one-of-a-kind types of objects, but they also reach another group of people, which are education reformers, and people who try to sort of teach people manual training, manual arts comes out of this, as well as what I think is one of the real significant sorts of contributions in the late 19th and early 20th century, and that is the amateur, somebody who is not going to be earning a living, but therefore time is not as important to, who are given some books that actually talk about process. It's the first time in which the art, trade, and mystery of making objects sort of gets put out into press, into writing. You find that equipment manufacturers start to gear up a lot of their work, tools that become individualized, and at the same time you have this growth of a professional sort of white-collar class who has leisure time because they have a different work week and they have home shops that they're able to sort of undertake some of these things. So to me, you know, what's curious over that trajectory, and I'm doing a disservice by just sketching in some of this, is there's an amazing change that takes place, I think, in terms of sort of the idea of making things. That yes, you still have a continuation of manufacturing in fairly, large scale, mid scale, even some small shop work. But all of a sudden, what you find is that there is this increased attention to almost the individual and the person who is oftentimes going to come from a different educational background that is supported by written material, published books, picture books, by tool manufacturing taking place at that point. And it sets us on a course over the course of the 20th century, I think really contributes to almost a parallel track to the manufacturing track, and that is this one-of-a-kind. And I decided, if you've got art furniture as sort of a reaction to manufactured furniture in the 1860s, the 1870s, if you think about, sort of, to borrow from Gustav Stickley, the idea of craftsman furniture in the early 20th century, where the tendency is to focus in on sort of visibly wrought workmanship in a variety of materials, and how there was an emphasis on both the amateur maker, somebody who's doing it for that sort of self-satisfaction, as well as objects that even if they come out of small shops or even large shops should have some sort of association with that background, the attention to making things, to then over the course of the 20th century, that idea of education really sort of working out, and a lot of those things coming together in the 1930s and 1940s to start contributing to people like Gordon Esherick. That Esherick, sort of somebody who's considered one of the grandfathers, I guess, of studio furniture, really comes out of that kind of a background of somebody who's schooled, who has access to materials, has the ability to experiment, and sort of is taking, working for friends and sort of slowly but surely building out a circle of clients. And it seemed to me that in essence, when I started thinking about a term, I came up with the notion of studio, because I felt in some respects this wasn't a term that had been used before, so I'm not sort of rehashing something, but I felt like it spoke to an issue of scale, that studio implies something smaller rather than factory production, rather than cabinet making shop, rather than industry or something like that. I thought that studio implied something to the attention to a physically small shop as well as the intimate sort of shop. Scale was right. I thought studio was also a good term because I felt like in some ways many people, one way or the other, are coming at this not through apprenticeship, but many of them are coming through either school, formal school, which schools were starting to come up in furniture design and craftsmanship starting in the late 1940s, but even sort of this idea of manual training and what that did in introducing people to making things as part of a curriculum, as a humanistic curriculum, starting back right at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. And it seems to me that, as one then starts to fold out what goes on within studio furniture, it's something that encompasses, it doesn't get at, you only can use a certain type of material, although wood dominated for many people in the 1940s, 1950s, down to the 60s, at which point then you have a proliferation of materials. It doesn't sort of speak to a certain aesthetic, because I think sometimes that can be quite difficult to sort of group all these things together, but it actually refers to sort of more of a cultural phenomenon rather than an aesthetic phenomenon. To get back to this exhibition, one of the things I was really intrigued with as I read through Amy's catalog is to thinking about how drawing fits into this kind of broad brush stroke sort of scenario. And it seems to me that it fits in a couple different ways. And I'd like to actually spend a little bit of time just talking about the whole process of drawing. What's the purpose of drawing, in essence? I think it's something we kind of, everyone uses the term drawing, but it seems to me that there's a way in which we need to be thinking about drawing with a historical dimension. And this, again, is sort of based on some of my experience in what exists out there. If I were to talk about drawing for a furniture maker in the 17th and 18th century, it's minimal. Where do you find that evidence? Well, there are a couple of account books that survive that someone simply draws an elevation of a high chest to sort of give a sense of proportion. There are some drawings that, I've seen some from the mid-18th century, I've seen some early 19th century drawings of a cabinet maker out here in Pennsylvania, actually, right nearby here, in which he sort of sketches in some of his different objects that he's made. They're almost sort of very quick, three-quarter view sorts of drawings. It doesn't seem, it's almost a drawing of record more than anything else. I mean, we tend to always want to say, oh, Chippendale's director, these published versions, which are not, those are not cabinet maker's drawings. Those are codified designs that are actually the engraver and the client producing these large folio volumes. That's the real purpose of those sorts of visual compilations. I'm talking about, drawing in some respects. I've also seen within people who are house joiners and woodworkers, if you actually start looking behind, chimney breasts, which are the panels over a chimney. I've seen other sorts of fragments. On the back side of these, oftentimes you'll see a craftsman just do a quick sketch of the arch of a buffet or cupboard, or you'll see them, try to articulate what a pilaster is going to look like. And you can see what he's done is he's just got his scrap wood there in the bench that he's set up. It's a temporary bench while he's finishing out the inside of a house, and he's done quick just to sort of keep in his mind, and he might refer to later on, but it's not something he's sitting there and doodling around while all this other stuff is going on. It's really sort of a, not even a working drawing, but it's just a reminder in some respects. It seems to me that there's an immediacy, there's an efficiency within drawing in some respects. It seems to me that it's not purposeful in the same way that we might think of drawing later on. Now, at a point where there is, that mid-19th century where I'm talking about crossovers in which artists coming out of different sort of educational training start to enter into the design phase of work, it seems to me that drawing all of a sudden is something very different, that they are oftentimes taught in German and French technical schools or elsewhere of drawing from live models or mechanical drawing. So there's this idea of replication. It's an exactitude of capturing something and sort of training one's eye so that then when they go on to actually draw in terms of their business, what they're oftentimes doing is conveying information. So exactitude to the conveying of information, because these guys like Godwin, Amy Morris, any of these people tend not to do the work themselves. A drawing or even a presentation drawing that's going to be for a client, or it's going to be a drawing for a craftsman who actually executed. And one can look through any numbers of shop interior photographs. I mean, one of my favorite ones is Tiffany and Company, the silversmiths in New York, where they had the fourth floor library, and you have guys all dressed up with their shirts and collars and ties, and there are volumes of books, there are casts of classical elements and things, and there are all these drawing boards set up. This was the design department at Tiffany. So these guys were drawing in the way that they were taught, and then the drawing then gets transferred to somebody down on a lower floor where actually the stuff is made. And oftentimes there's specific information for some of the people who are drawing, saying what kind of a hammer, somebody else says what kind of a raising hammer to use here, what element that's cast should be used here. And there's this whole way that I think that drawing is a means of information conveyance and communication. And to me, what has been really intriguing, and a lot of that sort of continues to this day. I know that there's some people who've worked with architects, studio furniture makers who work with architects who say you can always tell an architect piece, because oftentimes if you look at it head-on elevation, go down halfway, draw your crossbars, and you can see it as a drawing. And that's the way it looks best in some ways. But it seems to me that what's curious about what's taken place over the time, say, since World War II, or so with the studio furniture movement, is drawing, and it has taken on a whole different sort of use and purpose. And a couple things come to mind. One is that drawing is something that is an ongoing, constant way. Sometimes people are talking about details, sometimes people are talking about overall, sometimes if you look at the series of images upstairs in Tom Hucker's display, you'll notice that sometimes people are really talking about form, sometimes they're looking at background and what that does to the forms, and what Arthur Wesley Dow within his book Composition refers to as notan in terms of negative positive space and how those adjustments work. Sometimes it's to work out a joint detail, sometimes it's just a sort of almost a general association in some ways. And as you start to then look at that kind of variety of information, it's not to convey information, it's not to a specific purpose, but oftentimes it's generating ideas, working through ideas, trying out lots of elements. One almost gets a sense that in some ways this is not about temporal efficiency, but temporal exploration. And I think that that's something that's really important to think about, is within what's underlying the show is a different concept of time and a different concept of making time and making objects and making time. And I mentioned this quickly to Amy just goes, so nothing has changed. Research and development still isn't paid. It isn't recognized, and it's why people are always trying to figure out why does this stuff cost so much money. But a lot of it has to do with just these sorts of notions in which the purpose of drawing, and when I talk about drawing now, I think it's also important to realize that drawing is not only sort of working two-dimensionally on paper or whatever, but it's also three-dimensional modeling. And I was reminded of this when talking to a metalsmith that I know, Charlie Crowley, who's one of the most brilliant machinists I've ever seen, who talked about sketching on a milling lathe and the fact that he could generate form and play with form three-dimensionally much more quickly on a lathe with his skills than he could by drawing. He couldn't get at drawing. And I look at some of the things like Jerry does in terms of his models, or Isabel does with her models, and the relationship of drawing and models, and realize they're part and parcel of the same process. It's working through ideas, it's trying different elements, it's time-consuming. It's no longer sort of the apprentice mindset. Whenever you talk to somebody who's been trained in a traditional way, where all you're doing, an upholsterer I knew said that the whole basis of training in a shop was to work as quickly as you could with your own hands, with your own project that you were being paid for, by watching what somebody else was doing, to sort of then absorb what they were going to do and maybe experiment on your own that night. But there's that constant threat of what are you able to produce quickly enough? Can you make your presence economical within a shop? And it seems to me that what we're talking about within a show like this is the whole way in which development, generation of ideas is really key. And so I think it's that temporal quality that one really wants to think about a great deal.
Isabel and Jerry to show some of their work, and maybe as they do so, they can tell us a few of the ideas that they think about as they start to work with their projects. Maybe some drawing ideas as well as the actual projects themselves. Maybe Jerry, maybe you can start and then go to Isabel. Yes, please, would you? Wait, how is that set up in the carousel? It's set up that way? Okay, great.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I can't promise I'll stay in front of the speaker. This is a few slides that you can't hear.
You need to lean in towards the microphone more. Mark, you come out of the mic away from the speaker.
How's that?
Perfect.
Turn this one off towards me, just pivot towards me.
Pivot the microphone for you.
Oh, is that what you're feedback?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's too far away.
That's good.
Is that still all right?
Yeah.
All right. I tried to put together a few of these that I felt expressed what I was doing, what I have been doing over the years, and I'll mention a few things about the different pieces as they come on the screen. This is a very early one. It's important to me because I'm known for the shell forms, or the elliptical shell forms, and this was the first one that I did. So
It's a desk.
I liked it at the time. It's a desk. I'm always pleased if somebody doesn't know what it is. There's other pieces that are the same way. This is another desk, and this is much more recent, I guess you'd say. And it's a view of the desk closed. And there's some important points there for me in that I like the simplicity of the form. I really like that. It has you can see there's a line at the top, on the edge down a few inches, and the door rolls in under that. And so, yeah, technically it was, I've done 2 desks where I have invented a double axis rotation system for the doors, and this was the first one. It's Australian lacewood. This is another one that I like. I almost hate to say it, but it's a very good expression of the techniques of lamination that I use. In some ways, I'd rather not be known for the techniques than I would be for the furniture forms that I have created. And I felt this was a very, very good form. It is a desk. This is the side you don't sit at. If I tell you that's the back, you'll put it against the wall. So. This is a chest of drawers, and I talked a little bit about it yesterday. I've been trying to relate furniture to us, and the top is flat on this piece. The ends curve outward a little bit, and the drawer fronts also curve outward. There's a volume to the piece. It's a more organic form, and that's what I'm after. I feel it can relate to furniture better if it has this more organic form, because we are rounded, and when we reach for things, we don't reach in straight lines. So I feel it's an important aspect. otherwise it's a very woody piece. it's the whole works, dovetails, and so forth.
What kind of wood?
That's California walnut and with gaboon ebony handles. This is the chair that's upstairs, and quite important to me because it's the most recent chair. So over my career, I have done quite a number of chairs, and I like doing them. I feel that they're sort of a bridge piece. You know, you have a lot of contact with a chair. You sit in it or lie on it or whatever. Whereas a cabinet, you'll look at it and you'll store things in it and put things on it. But the chair has an engineering aspect to it. And so I really like developing the structures. But here again, I approach it as a form, almost a sculptural form, which is also meant to work as a comfortable chair. This is another one of my shell desks. It's the view of the desk closed. It opens up by pivoting on those knobs on the left and right. The shelf is Bubinga. It's all veneer construction. I make my, in a sense, I guess you'd say, I make my own curved veneer. The legs are Renga, and I like the color combination of the two. It's a very dark brown, which complements the Bubinga very well. The form, the shell form, has been very important to me, and I think it's a very interesting form for a piece of furniture, and it also fits my idea that furniture should, for us to relate to it, to have a more organic form. And this one, I also show you the inside. I like the closed form, and I like the simpler form that it shows when it's closed. So I would approach that as a cleaner sculptural form. This is meant to be functional with cubby holes and drawers that would fit papers. And this is a wave table. It just sort of switches directions a bit here. The other pieces perhaps have a bit more sophisticated technique. This is just sort of general woodworking, I guess, furniture making. And it was a tough design problem, but it did finally come to the solution for it. It's sort of bits, metaphorical bits in there. I saw it as parts of the seashore, the reeds and the sandbar, and I felt it was successful. It was a commission. I haven't mentioned much about that. I didn't mention much about it yesterday, but I do get a certain number of commissions, and I do get things that I do for the gallery that represents me on Long Island. And sometimes the commissions move me ahead better than me doing a piece on my own. I haven't come to the defining answer on that. If you are making things, you'll have to work that out yourself, because sometimes commissions are very restrictive. Size, wood, price is a big element, and this I didn't have any problems with that with this piece. The price was okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
On that last piece, on the bottom shelf, the different pigmentation, like you get light and dark, is that colored wood or is that shadow? It's almost...
Oh, that is the grain direction of the wood, but it's also this is quarter-sawn sycamore, and it changes color across the boards, and you sort of have to use it. There isn't enough wood to go around if you don't. So it's a question of me designing how I glued those pieces together. So I try to match them. So it was meant to be. But I don't color wood. I don't stain it or paint it. I have not exhausted the qualities of the wood yet. Then I'll move on to painting or staining. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Here on that table too, when I came closer to the view, there's 4 legs and 3 on the other side. And this is a leg floating in the bottom panel. Can you tell me a little bit about how that design works?
Oh, that made a lot of sense to me at the time. I had a lot of trouble with the design, and I finally went back to the original premise. It was a table to go in a house by the seashore, and I sort of missed that in the initial drawings. But as soon as I got that in my head that I was to think of the ocean, it worked out. The legs, as far as I was concerned at the time I was drawing it, are reeds. That's why there's 9 of them. There would be a lot of those, and the lower shelf was a sandbar. And I don't necessarily think it's a good idea to give you the libretto for a piece, but that was my thinking.
When they penetrate the plane, they seem to have space around them.
Yeah, but that's because if you go to the shore when the tide is coming in and the reeds are waving from the wind, they create a hole around the reeds. It moves into the sand that way. So I say it was very clear to me at the time, and it made sense. It made the design go together. Because the early sketches were very static. And so I'd like to think you can look at this now and not know what I just told you, and it's
clearly obvious, but it's always great for us, and particularly our students, to understand the origin of the joint.
Sir, are you taking questions while you're doing this or afterwards? We have our partners.
It seems appropriate to ask as we go.
Can you do me a favor, Lynn? Because if you look at the first slide you showed, that seashell desk, then you look at the second desk that you showed, the second seashell. One of the interesting to me was the amorphicness of the second one, which is not in the first one. To me, when I look at that second one, I almost think of fire hydrants that one sees, and if one looks at it very closely, one can almost see a little guy with his hat and 2 arms sticking out. And I think that if you go, that second one conjured up that same kind of image. The other thing I wanted to note was that if you noticed in your first desk,
the shelf desk.
The desk,
The one that he talked about, the side you didn't sit at.
right.
Oh,
And then if you look at the chairs that you did, 2 chairs that you showed, that same image seems to be there as well.
yeah, that's me.
Right.
I'll admit that desk was Angels in the Snow.
Right.
That's where that came from. I didn't mention that. A lot of the pieces do have some some beginning, but there's going to be bits of me leaking through each one.
Well, but just going back to what Dave was saying before about drawings, one of the things that I've noticed in my own drawings as well as other people's is sometimes you see pieces of the same sketch involving. So
Right.
and that's exactly what that seemed like to me. That same form just keeps going.
Yeah, I'm working from my sketchbook. I may see the same things again, and I also have trimmings hanging on the wall in my shop, which I use for curves, not for the final details, but I keep using them again.
Sure.
And it does work out that way. Okay. There's several of these shell desks in here, and I was very pleased with this one also. I worked a long time on it. I made actually full-size model of the piece. The end, particularly the model of the midpoint, was just bent cardboard. It may not be a very sophisticated model, but like the chair upstairs is a little more finished looking model. But for this, there was the modeling after the larger sketch drawings. It opens up along that fine line that you can see. And here again, with the piece closed, yeah, I was mainly very interested in this sculptural form of the piece, and that I feel worked out well. It lives in a museum in New Hampshire, the Courier Museum. So it's the only piece that's nearby that I can take friends to visit. All these other pieces are gone away to some other places. This is a piece that was just recently purchased by the Mint Museum in North Carolina. And it was one of these pieces that when I made it, I didn't really know what to make of it. I almost couldn't understand it. It's a very large desk. So it's 6.5 feet or so across the front. It has these doors that pivot on those. You see the bumps on the top? That's a pivot point, and you're looking at the left-hand door, and there's another door, there's two doors, in other words, they meet in the middle. And there's room to spread out all your papers there, and some drawers or cubby holes. It's an amazing form, and it's like I was saying yesterday, it has a very strong presence in the room when you meet it. It almost talks back to you because it's occupying so space there. It's not a tame piece of furniture. And it didn't sell initially, and so I had it back at my studio. And it's Macassar ebony, and then the legs are ash. That's a shot of the doors closed. See, they swing to the left and the right. There's a track system underneath. I put this one in. I didn't want to get too many slides in here. This is a detail on a table that I did, and I thought it was very successful as a form. And this was another case where we did a model, a full-size pine model of a leg, and then a piece of wood to represent the top. It's behind the corner of the table. That is California walnut on the top and European hornbeam, which is very similar to our holly that grows in the United States. This is a little table. I have a couple of, I don't think I put the other one in, but this is one that I did a few years ago, and it just keeps selling. I've made quite a lot of these, and it has some very nice sculptural details to it. It has legs, which I'd have to talk to Ned about whether they're Macintosh or Heffelwhite. I think the leg. But what was sort of a surprise to me, it was done for a faculty show, and that's a done thing. You do it once and forget it, but it keeps people still like them. And so they've either been ordered or I'll make one for whatever reason. This is an ash desk about between 5 and 6 feet long. It's all ash, and then a reddish brown leather. You can see a relationship to the other desk that was earlier in the slides. I know I've deliberately put them both in there, but not next to each other. This is the most recent one, and I think it's the only piece of furniture that's not sold. The group I belong to in New Hampshire has an auction coming up in October. No complicated shells or anything, just a good desk with a drawer. That's the last slide, I think, should be in detail.
How do you feel about computers?
The what?
It's okay to answer my question.
Great, thank you.
The training in exploring different materials and using sort of minimal budgets. And so I think that's where a lot of influences become apparent in the work that you're going to see. Something else something else that I really wanted to mention was the work here is mostly speculative work, which I fund by doing other commission work, which is not going to be in this show. So I spend a lot of time maybe building cabinets and dining room tables and things for different clients, and then spend the proceeds from those jobs in developing some of these ideas that I'm going to show you. A lot of my work is, I have an affinity for chair forms and seating forms, and I think that's a lot to do with the fact that I like the expressive nature of a chair and the structural components and the visual components and the ergonomic components that go into that. And I also think it's a reprieve from building like much larger pieces, which I do for the commission. So it's that I really enjoy the scale of the chair. It's much more manageable. This microphone's really difficult. Other things that I'm very interested in, which motivate my work, are other recurring themes are motion. I really enjoy things that move a lot and react to when you interact with them, and also using
a minimum of materials when I'm building things structurally, which means like a lot of time I'll build these prototypes or full-size models that often fail. So it's you know, it's always there's a large degree of chance of working sort of towards the borders of the perimeter of what a material can actually do. So that said, I'll show you some slides. This is a swing that I made of beaten copper. I've been really fortunate to have access to shops and facilities where there have been other people that have taught me a huge amount in technique and using different materials. And this is an example of that. It started off as a 2-foot circle of copper, and it's been upholstered in leather. These are a rocking stool and a rocking bench. They're identical in side elevation, and they have a torque that runs through the seat. And then this one, the bench is actually 5 feet long. The stool is 12 inches by 12 inches square, and it's carved and finished. It's carved in ash. Finished with lime wax. Cheers. A lot of John Makepeace, like when I was studying John Makepeace's school, we had access to his studio and would see how a lot of his pieces were constructed and went together. And I was really horrified to find that a lot of his pieces are held together with threaded rod. Of the interior, just to hold these amazing forms together. So actually, this is my nod to that technique of holding things together with threaded rod. I think I used to spend a huge amount of time developing my ideas in drawings, and would spend days at the drawing board, developing design ideas. And I found that I could draw things that I couldn't build sometimes. I could get really seduced by this amazing thing that you have going on in 2 dimensions, and then you just come to build it, and it sort of doesn't work. And I think as my sort of career progresses, I've become much more adept at having an idea, sketching it, probably spending much less time sketching it out, and then just developing it through models and in 3 dimensions. And that's becoming more of a way that I find more beneficial to work in that way. This is a set of tables that's all interconnected with a Jacob's ladder 180-degree hinge, which is in leather, which is inset into the sides of the tables, so you can actually put them in any orientation. It's black walnut and sand blasted glass. This was some work that I became very interested in working in recycled materials, and I spent quite a long period of time developing some ideas using sheet material. And this is recycled high-density polyethylene, which is detergent bottles, and I think the trade name is confetti for the sheet material. And I was trying to, I produced quite a few of these rocking chairs, and but became very frustrated about the quality of the material. You could never actually guarantee the quality of material. When it had flaws in it, it would have weaknesses. If there was dirt in the sheet material, then it would start fracturing. So I sort of got pretty frustrated with it, but I did have a lot of, I really enjoyed developing these ideas.
By the way, did you see the rod pieces similar to he uses he uses a carbon fiber?
Yeah, he did those. Yeah, I've seen those. This is like a low rest idea, and this is held together with plastic rivets are just all held in tension. And this is, I think it's low density polyethylene, and it's a material that's used to make plastic hinges out of in the fractures, no matter how hard you wear it.
Does that deflect?
So it deflects when you sit in it, and if you're sort of on the heavier side, you sit on the floor, it's a bit embarrassing. So I usually, when I'm just experimenting, I usually say, oh, if it's okay for me, it's okay for everybody else, but I've gotten over that. But it's fun. This is a piece that I was just trying to design a chair for production, possible production, and this was designed to be just made out of, stamped out of one single sheet, and it's sheet steel. And all these prototypes that were made actually were made with separate legs and then welded on once the form had been folded. But it's basically inspired by origami form, where the strength in the structure is formed by the folds in the material. This is a pair of, I don't know, lounge chairs, and they look particularly sort of uncomfortable. Everybody says, oh, they look really frightening. But the rods are held in the frame and on the front and back legs, and they're floating at the center where they intersect through the back of the seat. And so they actually yield to conform to your body, and they're sort of springing. So they're much more comfortable than maybe you anticipate when looking at them.
What's the material?
It's stainless steel.
They pinch.
Pardon?
They could pinch.
Oh, I guess so. I didn't have any of those complaints.
You're saying the two frames are joined at the edge?
Yeah, at the edge, and then when they intersect like this, they float.
So they're just pinned at any point where?
I mean, they're welded just like here and here, I think, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then to hold the triangulated form, and then all these float down through each other. I've been recently, I don't know, spending a huge amount of time developing a technique of all these, which is, I'm not really sure of its value, but it's I spent a lot of time looking at Islamic art and Japanese shoji screen technique construction, and I wanted to start using these patterned surfaces as more of a structural component. And so I've been developing, and it's not pictured actually, I don't have photos of the most recent piece, but actually having these all intersect and all join together, so inherently they're structurally sound when they're all together, almost like a tensegrities structure. So they're actually, all the pieces are very weak, but when they're joined together, they're all stepped rabbet and interior miters, and they go together, but it's not actually pictured here, but this is the way that my work is sort of evolving currently. So, and this is a chair that I was incorporating that technique into.
You were saying, Isabel, that you were looking at images of cat's cradles, of strings that were pinned together, and I'm wondering if that is all coming into one place there.
I don't know, I think the whole thing, I sort of got really bored of doing all this, not bored, but just like found some of my work quite sterile and hard, and I wanted to incorporate pattern, but in a way that was inherent in the structure. And so, and also develop sort of more of a lighter feel. And so this was like one way that I did this maybe 2 years ago, I think something like that. And it's grown with the piece upstairs, looking at.
Tell them about the materials of that piece upstairs, because I think there's some misinterpretation of what that's made out of.
Oh, so the frame upstairs is steel, but but the actual lacing or the upholstery, or whatever, the lacing is almost laced like a tennis racket. It's nylon lacing, so it actually deflects when you sit in it, even though it's pretty sturdy.
I've sat in it, it's actually very comfortable. Okay.
So yeah, this is my last slide, so if you have any questions.
Because of the way the coloring, etc., makes it look more like a presentation drawing in some respects. But then, just look at, say, some of the, I was really struck by this today, looking through what Tom has pulled together, in which what you're doing is you're playing with permutations, and you're setting it in lots of different ways, because in some respects, what you were interested in is not, was exploring the context. It's not just color changes, but it's exploring sort of the context and the personality of this. And the drawings were really quite vivid about sort of personality of objects, because then I also had the advantage of knowing the way you work through the actual forms and models of those as well. So there's that constant sort of tension that I think really exist within those drawings, and to know that there is that sort of life-giving quality to it, and exploring. Now, in terms of scale, I mean, you're somebody who obviously is expressing dissatisfaction. There's been a long tradition of people who are interested in built form, but who get frustrated at that kind of interaction on scale. I mean, it exists. Jerry was somebody who started off in architecture, George Nakashima, all these people, there are a lot of people who started off with an architectural background who then get frustrated because of the inability to realize, to be involved in wanting to work on a smaller scale. That said, I mean, some people will just reduce, but there's another model, and here I tend to think that historically of Charles and Henry Green out in Pasadena, where they designed everything, and the reason they were able to do that is they believed in a term that was popular in the arts and crafts movement in Boston that Charles A. Norton coined, and that was mutually helpful relations. What that translates, it's fancy words for trusted subcontractor, basically. But with a different philosophy in some respects, in that the way Charles and Henry Green were set up from the Boston arts and craftsmen, where they were trying to have architects and designers work with craftsmen, and in a way that craftsmen weren't trusted with design so much as the architects were. They brought historical styles and other ideas, and it was that kind of collaboration, so that the Greens, for instance, were known for going to the Hall Brothers shop and sort of spending time hanging out at the benches, and Charles actually did some carving, which was a historically sort of amateur work for a lot of people back in the 1870s. They didn't mind him coming in and working with live oak panels and carving live oak images on teak or something like that. But the fact is, Charles was involved, he was in the shop a fair amount, but he wasn't cutting joints, he wasn't doing that, but there was that intimacy. And the same thing was true with Judson Studios, with his stained glass work, with ornamental ironwork. I mean, across the map, Charles and Henry Green, now what happened to us was really expensive design build work.
Same thing with Carlos Scarpa. And I think the question...
Shorter time span, not necessarily 20 years, but in this case, some of them last 6 years.
Yeah, the involvement and the level of craft seems to be responsive to a dialogue, a dialogue between the designer, the craftsperson, but also the material of the time. And I think one of the reasons one of many reasons why I got out of practice is I really felt the drawings were losing their value in the sense of, again, they were, rather than pulling me closer to a construction, they were pushing me farther away.
Yeah, and here's one other little side shoot off of that. I've also been curious how in the 1980s, with this whole idea of the commodification of design, how a lot of the architects who got into designing household objects under Swid Powell, etc., in some respects, they did it as a form of marketing in some ways. It was an easy way to make efficient use of your studio, you know this well. But at the same time, you create a commodity that can get sold in and of itself. So the drawing, the marketing rights and all that end up sort of satisfying a whole different way of thinking about that drawing.
Just let me, if you don't mind, one example. My studio is in a sheet metal shop. And one day there's this huge commotion downstairs because this architect is screaming at the proprietor. Why is he screaming at the proprietor? This architect gave the proprietor a drawing, and the sheet metal guy built it to the drawing and the dimensions of the drawing. What the architect never told this manufacturer was it was an isometric drawing. Okay. I don't.
You build an isometric.
Wow.
Yeah, really cool. Except, but of course, not what the architect see. From my experience, I never, if I'm making a product, like for example, Ned was just talking about Swid Powell. When you're making a piece that is going to be reproduced, in other words, you're letting it out of your hands and you're having someone else doing it for you, then everything has to be detailed down to the last minutia. You don't want to.
It seems like you can never. When I was doing that with a house,
well,
you can never get down. You can never get get down, and I would even think in a piece of, in a cultural artifact, there's something about, even if I'm wanting to cut a metal angle out of a square, and I have to drill a hole first to put the blade in, you know, and you're kind of going to that edge, someone like Carlos Scarpa would say, well, I want to see that hole there. So rather than, so all of a sudden, just because watching the drill press come down,
that's
you know
what
I mean? So
those are the decisions that the architect or the designer takes into account. When you're making multiple pieces, again, going back to Smith Powell, you don't want anyone changing your dimensions. You don't want the craftsperson, the manufacturer, to mess with your. If he wants to do something else, let him do what he wants to do. But you're giving him the object, you're giving him the dimensions, you're giving him the materials, you're giving him everything. When you work as an individual, and going back to the sketch, I think that what the sketch is this is my initial concept of what I want this piece to look like. What happens between the time we start to build that piece and we finish that piece might not be as similar as what the sketch looks like. Because as you're working on the piece, as you're building the piece that you have the idea that you made the sketch of, something might happen that makes it much better. Something that might happen, like she was mentioning, that it just doesn't work. And again, everyone has made things that don't work. I mean, the drawing looks great, you know, the material looks great, you put it together, it falls apart.
But I guess what I'm looking for is how do you allow one to enter into the other? For example, in the Renaissance, when a master architect would do a drawing, they did these drawings called analytiques that were similar, where you were mentioning, where they had a little detail, a plan, a section, all these things that were kind of the thought process of almost like a kit of parts, but not really. But it actually then, when given to the master builder kind of said, okay, I get what you're doing, so therefore, when I'm on the site and something comes up and you're not here, I know what the better decision to make. And how do you, because I want to be able to see manufactured housing or housing that's done in a mass to still retain the quality that you get in studio furniture. You know, it shouldn't be this break where you say, okay, if you're going to do 10 of them or 20 or 100, because you have the legal documents, because I didn't think of every little detail, something goes wrong and the lawyer sues me and all that other stuff. But more so, how do you teach the students to say, how do you communicate your ideas so when they are built, there is room for the craftsman to make a decision similar to the way you would?
I hate to do this because the conversation is just getting going and everybody's all excited to talk about this. But what I would like to suggest, it's 6 o'clock and the opening is supposed to start. But what I'd like to suggest is that we continue the conversation upstairs and around the snacks. Is that what we're doing? So please feel free to stick around and jump into the fray of this conversation. But we need to let everybody go. And I thank you so much for coming. And I really thank our